Welcome, everyone, to week one of No Plastics for Lent. My name is Baird Linky. I'm here with Ellie Derringer, our lovely co host, and we are joined today by our blog writer for this week, Pastor Emmanuel Correa Vasquez. Pastor Emmanuel, would you like to introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about where you're coming from.
As you know, my name is Pastor Emmanuel Correa Vasquez. I'm a Puerto Rican pastor who's currently in serving in New England in a lovely congregation called the House of Prayer Lutheran Church in Hingham, Massachusetts, which is the South Shore, kind of a coastal area. So other than that, well, I'm just a Puerto Rican pastor here in New England. That's how I would just.
Well, coming to us from House of Prayer, we made the right choice then, I think, in asking you to talk about prayer. We've been asking people as we start off these conversations just what your experience growing up was with Lent, if it's a tradition that you have a lot of history with, or if you're coming at it with fresh eyes, what has that looked like for you?
Lent for me has been a learning curve because I didn't grow up celebrating Lent. I grew up in the Baptist church in Puerto Rico, and um, Lent was something that the Catholics did, basically. And so even for like Ash Wednesday, for example, it's a school day, so you would be in school, and if you are in a Catholic majority school, they would kind of take all the Catholic students to the basketball court where the priest was ready to kind of impose the ashes and everything. And then they put all the Protestant and atheists and agnostics into a classroom because they were not partaking of Ash Wednesday. So that's kind of like some of my particular memories regarding Lent. And of course, no meat on Fridays and all this kind of stuff, which from the Baptist roots of mine in Puerto Rico, they're still fighting the Reformation battles. They're like, we don't do that. We don't. Um, but got to know a little bit more about Lent once I became a Lutheran, and kind of it was close to my arrival in New England, like let's say 5, 6 years ago. Um, so the practices, the discipline that comes with Lent, I think has been a benefit. It has been some a way to focus that, or let's say it gives a framework. It gives me a framework to which I can build upon. Um, and I think it's very countercultural in many regards. And I think, Baird, we've had this, or you've mentioned this in previous conversations about kind of this non-consumeristic spirituality when we're asked to give things up, or we're asked, to fast, to not consume.
The counterculture is interesting, especially because there are parts of our culture that are really shifted around Lent, like have the fish
Hmm.
on Fridays and all of that. It feels like Lent does have this strange cultural weight in a couple different areas, and then if the you
Hmm.
start to scratch the surface and you're asking a lot of Americans not to consume the way that they're used to. And
Hmm.
I feel like so much of our idea of what freedom is in America is like the freedom to consume exactly how you want. And
Hmm. Hmm.
it can be interesting to challenge that a little bit of like what's our freedom actually rooted in, and what does it look like to make those choices? Because hopefully you're making that choice freely, not to consume just as much as you're making it to consume. But
Well, and it's a challenge, right? Because you have, um, even from, let's say, a spatial point of view, you go down the road, especially in Puerto Rico, where there's kind of unfettered capitalism. Sometimes, all those interests kind of coalesce, and you have all these fast foods conglomerating down the main street. And then you have all these ads, and it doesn't even beautify the space. It's just you have all these, buy, 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 get this special, get this and whatnot. So it's like in your face all the time. And how to manage those temptations not to consume, not to buy, is a challenge. You have literally have to sometimes even go out of a place, like, or kind of like Jesus going out into the wilderness, like we go out into the desert or something like that, to give a monastic example. And that's not easy in these times. It's not easy to escape that.
I think something you mentioned earlier about like discipline, thinking about the discipline that it takes to resist some of those temptations or to kind of focus on what's important to you. Um, there is this idea like we can separate ourselves if we need to, kind of diminish some of those temptations. And also, and you've talked about a little bit in your writing too that we'll get into. I don't want to spoil it, but talking about being in relationship and having more of that close relationship with each other and with creation and how that helps kind of aid that discipline. I
Mhm.
just think it's interesting, kind of these two balancing ideas that aren't quite at odds. I think again, they're just kind of in balance of separation, discipline, closeness, how that all plays together to be able to fulfill kind of our maybe our vocation as stewards in relationship with creation.
Absolutely. Sometimes, like, and this is another monastic example, I guess. Monks in the desert, for example, in the old Christian days, they would kind of they would try to be hermits and whatnot, but that was not the purpose at the end of it. That kind of solitude was not sustaining.
Mm.
In the end, you have to get closer to God, which is a primary relationship, and then get closer to your neighbor and get closer to your community. Once you go down from the mountain to the community to pray and to eat and to be in brotherhood and to exemplify the virtues. So, like any type of solitude or separation or discipline has to, in some way, go back to the neighbor. It
Mm.
has to connect once again in charity and love and mercy with other people and with God's creation, and also as a praise to God, as kind of some of the Lutherans might say. We do good works to praise God, not for any salvation purpose or anything.
Mm. Hmm. Speaking of the blog that you wrote, the the writing that Ellie mentioned, I want to start actually at the end of your blog with this scene that you paint for us in the woods up at Camp Calumet, and these kids who have been out in the woods playing with each other, doing all the normal crazy kid stuff, and then you sit down and have them sit still by the lake for 10 minutes and
Hmm.
they want more.
Hmm.
They ask to like instead of moving on to the next part of the schedule, or if there can be more places in the schedule for time just like that.
Hmm.
I'm wondering what you think they were finding in that like
Hmm.
time of silence there that they're like this good more please yes, especially
Hmm.
because when I think of a bunch of like middle school kids running around, the last thing that I anticipate from them is stillness and the desire for for quiet. But maybe that's just me projecting my own experience of being a middle schooler into that a little too much.
Well, but it naturally so. Also think, and this is just kind of me assuming, from what I observed, is that we do live in a time in which um, there's a lot of information, there's a lot to take in. Even when we're alone, we're not necessarily disconnected from the world or what's
Mm,
happening. Suddenly, you get a text message, you get some news article or something, you get something trying to grab your attention. So we live in a very hyper-stimulated society. Um, and when we reach to the stillness, or when we go to a place in nature, like there in Camp Calumet in New Hampshire, um, that those stimuli kind of dissipate a little bit and
mm,
transform into something else. Then your mind has to reconfigure according to this new input or lack of input, to say. Um, so in this case, the silence, I think, was refreshing, um, because they weren't, there was nothing to be gained at all. They were just needed to be there. And the natural environment, the also the community just being together, knowing that also there's no prize at the end of this, but we are ideally um, fostering our relationship to God, because that's what we're trying to do, to pray.
mm.
in this kind of very beautiful scenery, um, kind of prompted something different. It was something different that I think they don't necessarily get like in their school lives or in their daily lives. So
Hmm.
I think that's what kind of was being triggered for them in a sense.
Hmm.
It felt good. Um, and some of them, and I'm not I wasn't like, sit straight, something like that. Or, if they wanted to like lie down and kind of even take a nap or whatever,
Hmm.
in that moment of silence, even that could count as a kind of being a prayerful space together, because we were all just there basking in the moment.
And it's evoking memories that I have from my summer camp that I went to, and we did an exercise like this. And I think initially I was kind of in Baird's camp of like, I'm not gonna like this. This is gonna be so boring. Like how am I gonna be silent for this long? And then at some point, a few minutes in, something clicked, and I, found more enjoyment of that stillness. And I was, around middle school aged. And I think now I'm no longer in middle school, but I still like am craving those structures to encourage me to take time both to kind of disconnect from the constant parasocial connections that we have through social media and technology, which is a great tool, but
Mhm.
also it's like simultaneous over connection and under connection.
Hmm.
Um,
Mhm.
and so I think in that silence, you're reducing some stimulus, but also kind of attuning yourself to pay attention. And so, therefore, kind of strengthening that connection with the place that you are, the other living beings around you, and also yourself. I think an important note there is kind of getting to choose how to be in a prayerful mindset or kind of mode of being. Um,
Mhm.
I know for me, it never really worked for me. Like I don't like bowing when I pray. I
Hmm.
prefer to be more open and depends on kind of the situation. But it makes me like when I stand up a little bit straighter and I'm literally opening up my body a little bit more, I feel like I'm more open to some sort of connection with the people around me and with God. And I know for some people it's a lot easier to bow or to write or to draw or to connect it to movement. And I think that's so powerful, especially with, middle schoolers saying, no,
Mhm.
this is your time to
Hmm.
feel connected to what works for you and to make
Mhm.
it feel like it's something that's powerful and important for you. That's a choice you get to have, and that is divine as well.
I just felt myself subconsciously or self-consciously just like straightening up. Anytime someone talks about posture, it's like, oh, that's right. I should hold
Like
it
Transformer locking in.
in.
Yeah.
Emmanuel, I think that gets us to a place where when we talk about these things for Lent, the prayer, the fasting, these are disciplines that we take on. These are practices that we have to maintain. How do you think about prayer as being a thing that you need to like practice or develop, um, or have discipline around? How does
Mhm.
that factor into your imagination of it, especially in a time like Lent where the focus is trying to really highlight those rhythms or routines that we,
Mm.
speaking for myself, sometimes aren't as rigid in maintaining or disciplined in doing. So how are you thinking about that as we go into this season?
And there's no shame in it. Like sometimes we, pastors in
I
particular.
feel some
Um,
shame about it. That's
yeah, 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 yeah. Like I think, true. It is supposed to be our kind of avocation to pray. We have a calling to pray, especially for our congregations. But I think it's kind of is widely known that sometimes pastors and we get like bogged down in these busybody kind of um, this capitalist mindset, so to speak, of production. Um, that then, we prayer then becomes this kind of ineffective tool, or it can become, we can just sideline it because it's so easy to sideline. Um, but precisely, prayer is this for me, or how I at least ideally see it within my own life, how I try to cultivate in my own life. Um, is the same way as there is a relationship. There is this, if God and Jesus Christ is, someone, a person that I love and that I'm seeking to serve. So I
Mm.
try to approach him and consult him and, and be with him and spend time, even if it's just kind of, just scattered thoughts, or if it's just breathing, just because I'm just like, oh my God, I don't know what to do. So as you can see in the back, that's my little altar. Um,
Mm.
and there obviously is an image of Jesus over there, and Jesus the Good Shepherd and other little mementos.
I had a
Uh,
feeling I recognized him, might have seen him around
yeah,
someplace.
yeah, exactly. He exactly. It's like some guy you might know, but so yeah, it's just kind of just standing in the presence of God, and
Mm.
in reverence, trying to connect to that, um, trying to connect to something that is just beyond, my usual thought patterns and worries. And
Mm.
a pastor of mine reported from a confirmant of his, who said that prayer was like putting things in a cupboard or something. You just
Hmm.
there's like it's in your heart, and then you just put it. Okay, I'm gonna put it in God's shelf now. All
Aw.
right. So I found that totally helpful. Um,
God's little
so
pantry of prayers.
yes, God's little pantry of prayers.
That's
Exactly,
great.
exactly. I think that's kind of the habits that we develop around that. The same way,
Mm.
you call your mother, you call your dad, you call somebody else, regularly, or if you have that relationship, you kind of do the same with God in a sense.
Mm.
And also, from a Lutheran point of view, Luther would say, you're commanded to pray. That's how he says it. There's a commandment to pray. So you do it because if you don't feel like it, which happens often sometimes, you do it because you know you have that calling to do that.
Mm.
You have that out of obedience or out of a sense of belonging or reverence or whatnot. So there are many ways to approach it, because there is sometimes prayer that is very lovely and has good feelings, and sometimes it feels like that. But there are times in which prayer can feel dry,
Mm.
and sometimes we don't have the the attitude to prayer, disposition to pray. And sometimes, like some of the mystics might say, you just keep on at it. You keep kind of beating the rock in a sense until it breaks.
Mm.
Um, and maybe something will come out of that dryness. There's all these dynamics to prayer which are very powerful and correspond to our emotional selves and to what's going on in our lives. But it's always important to kind of like release. You know, that's what Luther calls prayer. Is lifting up the hearts, and we do it in communion all the time. Lift
Mm.
up your heart, we lift them to the Lord.
Mm.
That's prayer. That's the simple basic activity of prayer.
Mm.
I'm curious if you touched on this in your blog a little bit, but if you could just speak to that relationship between prayer and action, and sometimes this prayer as response to inaction, but also the limitations of prayer becoming inaction, or just kind of that interplay with all of that. How do you relate to kind of those balancing forces, and what would you kind of wish to share with people who are frustrated or kind of working through that?
It's a constant struggle sometimes. There is, I think I phrased it in the blog post as sometimes prayer can be ineffective jabbering. With that's definitely that it can feel that way, or like just talking, to doesn't go beyond the ceiling, as some people say. You
Mm.
pray and go beyond the ceiling. Um, and sometimes people pray, or very pious people pray, um, but don't do anything. Kind of like they're like just pray about it. For example, when sometimes things require action, or things require a response, or saying something, not remaining silent in the face of, let's say, any, um, like in this political climate, for example, in the face of migrants, or in the undocumented peoples in the U.S. being maligned, and you can't just remain silent and just like, let's all pray about it and
Mm-hmm.
just do that. Um, Ideally, prayer also leads us to, for a softer heart, because you know that in your heart of hearts, you are this vulnerable human being who is finite, as we celebrate now in Ash Wednesday.
Mm-hmm.
So you should recognize that also in your neighbor, and that we're all in God's embrace. Therefore, that logic of it should lead us to more compassion, to more action, to more responsiveness. Because if we're attuned to hearing God's voice, how can we not be attuned to hearing the cry of our neighbor? If we
Mm-hmm.
can't hear God in the cry of our neighbor, then who are you even listening to in your quiet prayer time?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that those interrelationships are what kind of I was trying to get at. Um, Kind of like prayer softens us up in a sense,
Mm-hmm.
makes us receptive, because to listen to God and to dialogue with God, we need great listening. We need great stillness and
Mm-hmm.
open and receptivity. So um, in that way, it leads directly to the cry of the poor, which Leonardo Boff says, you have the cry of the poor, in economic circumstances, and you also have the cry of Mother Earth, which is one of the poorest, because of how she's been, et cetera, et cetera. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so for me, there's a natural relation between all that, all those dynamics.
I just want you to know if I had a mic, I would drop it at a few moments in that. So.
I love that, Emmanuel, and I think that that connection to the the way that paying attention to God, paying attention to our neighbors, inevitably leads us to paying attention to the earth. Is It's a dynamic that we sometimes skip over, and we can often just like take our environment for granted because it's the thing that we live in. There's nothing more routine or normal to us than living on a planet, if except if you zoom out. Oh, hold on, we live on a planet, and that planet has dirt and that dirt has life in it, is like one of the craziest things that we normalize in our lives all the time. And we need to have that time set aside for us to kind of be interrupted by that, for the normal routines of our life that help us to move through and think that food comes from a grocery store and not from a field. Uh,
Hmm.
we need something to interrupt that pattern that lets the world become this taken for granted thing as opposed to the gift that it is.
Hmm.
And I think that your framework here of prayer as really intense listening is so
Hmm.
helpful for that. The thing that I notice when I try to go sit at the lakeshore and be still is that silence isn't quiet necessarily, like
Hmm.
or vice versa. That when I feel the most still, when I feel the most quiet, it's usually when I can hear wind or water, or I can hear birds, and it's not just my constantly jammering head. I think like
Hmm.
I am really prone to your ineffective jabbering. I think that that's kind of the space that I feel really comfortable in, and
Hmm.
carving out that space for prayer is hard sometimes, but I notice the difference when I am prioritizing that time apart. And I just wish that every day when I wake up, I would remember how good it felt yesterday when I was like, I don't have time. I don't want to pray. And then I did it. And then it felt great for the rest of the day. And I wake up the next day and that experience is completely gone from my mind. My memory of how
Hmm.
nice that was is gone, non-existent anymore.
Well,
And I,
that is why, in a sense, the Psalms are so great, because
mm,
it kind of leads us through all those different modalities that we feel. Kind of that there is that, oh, I can't pray, so I just, here you go, God, like I'm angry about all this stuff, or I'm really worried about all this stuff.
mm,
But there's also kind of like, one day in your courts is like, it feels like this overabounding joy and
mm,
tranquility. Um, so like we are in that roller coaster,
Mm,
and it's kind of like it's the day to day, it's natural, totally natural.
I think, Baird, you just talking about that like silence, um, kind of balance of, I think the absence of human noise,
mm,
our ears are more tuned to pick up the sound of the wind or what other noise, the rustlings or the other noises we just ignore, kind of assume are benign or just kind of always there in the background. Um, I think it's just like a helpful way to think about the fact that that's happening all the time. Even if you're not at like a camp or a retreat center or at a lakeside, even if you're in the middle of a city or a neighborhood, what would the world be like without human chatter or human involvement? We don't know that world, and that's not necessarily what what anyone is advocating for is to take humans out of out of the equation
Hmm.
of influence over the world. It's more, what
Hmm.
are those relationships? When is our chatter too loud? When is it not just the, say, jabbering? Um,
Hmm.
when is our prayer just jabbering, and when is it
mm,
relationship building? When is our relationship with the rest of the world and creation, when is that like jabbering? And when is it a fruitful,
Hmm.
reciprocal relationship full of reciprocity and this kind of, appreciation for abundance? I think
mm.
it just, all of this feels so interconnected. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think I posted in the blog post with a phrase that Leonardo Wolff uses is kind of relinking, kind of he uses
Mm,
that word of relinking or reestablishing the relationships, the wholeness of everything. That
mhm,
we're all kind of an interdependent whole. And that prayer is supposed to kind of lead us into that, into a restored relationship to creation, a restored relationship to God, kind of returning to that, returning to the earth, returning to, what it means to be part of this ecosystem, and not just standing over it, which is,
mhm,
as Jesus said in the Gospels, it's not the way Christians go. We don't lord our power over others. So how could we also lord our power over creation in that way instead of coexisting, and
mm,
serving the steward? Um, so that is I think that's like right on it. It's like
mhm.
that relationality, that relinking, that reestablishing our relationships. It's prime activity of prayer.
Well, I don't think that we're going to do much better than that in summarizing this, and we only have a couple minutes left. So I want to thank you for your wisdom, for your blog post, and for your time. This was a really fun conversation. And uh, is there anything that we can be praying for?
I think one of the main prayers is for society at large.
Mm,
We are very divisive times, and our prayers should be concentrated in, sometimes they call that a change of heart,
mm,
in the people who are in power, that they might repent for their war on the poor, right now, um, and um, praying for the people that are the least of these right now, the people who are being persecuted, the people who, um, have a lot to lose from
mm.
many of the decisions that are happening. I think those people kind of deserve our attention, right now in this moment. Um, and of course, prayer for all congregations who are trying to do the good work of the Lord Jesus Christ. So,
Amen.
including
Amen.
mine and yours and everybody else's. So,
Thank you, Emmanuel. Thank you, Ellie. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And we'll be back next week to talk about our next blog and our next speaker. Take care until then.